Hello, my name is Benjamin Hart. I'm an American attorney and managing director of Integrity Legal here in Bangkok, Thailand. The thumbnail for this video, I took it from a scene in The Sopranos. For those who are fans of that show, I'm a big fan of that show. I love that show when it came out. Pretty much watched every episode as it came out, and I've loved it ever since. There's a great scene in season one, and it's kind of one of the more iconic episodes where he's taking his daughter around to visit colleges while at the same time having to execute a hit on some guy that was a rat from the old days or something. But there's a scene in there where his daughter asks, "Are you in the mafia?" And, he kind of flips out and he's like, "No, I'm not in the mafia. There is no mafia," And she's kind of rolling her eyes, and eventually he admits, "Yeah, well, maybe I'm a bit of a wise guy." And it's an interesting scene, and we'll get to the analysis, sort of how I analogized that to this topic here in a moment. Really quickly, I think it's important to point out, I do deep dive analysis of stuff involving geopolitics, banking, finance, economics, as well as immigration and visas, how that interacts with expat land out here in Thailand, and how it interacts just kind of generally in terms of just trying to live out here in Southeast Asia. In a way, it's kind of news, but it's more the analysis that I think people find interesting about that. So if you're interested in that kind of deep dive analysis, please check us out. media@integrity-legal.com is the email address, and we'll get you on the email chain to go ahead and receive that deep dive analysis from our paid news service, Integrity News Service. Also, while I'm talking my book, I think it's worth pointing out that my better half and I did set up a restaurant here in downtown Bangkok, Pancake Palace. As the name implies, it's breakfast anytime, as well as American diner style food. We've got cheeseburgers, hamburgers, as well as buffalo wings, and again, breakfast anytime. You can check us out. You can find us in the links below to get our location and come see us there, and we'd love to see you. But going back to The Sopranos, where there is no New World Order, I thought of that scene immediately when I read this article from the Bangkok Post, bangkokpost.com. Article is titled, "No, quote, New World Order, only global disorder," which this is one of these things where it's almost come full circle. If you talked about the quote-unquote New World Order back in the 90s, you were just called a crazy conspiracy theorist. And I was young then, but I'm kind of a politics nerd, and I follow these things across the spectrum. And by politics nerd, I was at the '88 RNC convention. I went to the straw polls in '92 and '96 as a kid. These are the things that I did as a kid. I am kind of a politics nerd, but I also watch things from across the spectrum, including, from the so-called liberal press, as well as from the so-called fringe, alternative media, whatever. And I've always found that poo-pooing the notion of New World Order seems to be a trope of, frankly, folks, the same kind of folks that I've had a problem with who are trying to unduly influence Thailand here, aka folks like the World Economic Forum, etc., who, to my mind, have already done pretty untold damage to certain aspects of the U.S. and seem to have set their sights, at least in recent months, although I'm kind of wondering if there might be a lull in this activity now, but in recent months have set their sights on Thailand, and we've seen a lot of the fallout from that, not least of which, national debt issues, as well as, the attempt to put us under sort of tokenized totalitarian financial sort of grid type of thing. Again, it hasn't been particularly good, but one thing I have enjoyed is that, in a sense, enjoyed is probably the wrong word, is I find some level of satisfaction in, is the fact that it looks to me like the Thais are seeing it for what it is, and that's definitely a good thing. That said, quoting again from this article in the Bangkok Post, bangkokpost.com, no, quote, New World Order, unquote, only global disorder. There is no, quote, New World Order, unquote. That's how the article starts, which, by the way, for people that want to poo-poo that term, and I get it, there is a lot of really spurious information that's sort of floating around as detritus throughout the ether of the internet on the so-called New World Order. But at the same time, George H.W. Bush used that exact term in multiple speeches of his, as did his son. And then we'll hear these things like, and I'll get to that in a moment, rules-based international order and things. There is an international order, and I'm really kind of tired of this. It's really a played-out trope in my mind of undermining people or trying to discredit or belittle people who bring up serious concerns they have for their country, the sovereignty of their country, international financial issues, etc., and just base it on, oh, are you a conspiracy theorist? You use the term New World Order. Yeah, you're not the only, conspiracy theorists are not the only ones using it. Former presidents of the United States have used that term. That said, quoting again, there is no quote unquote New World Order, although there is certainly a New World Disorder. The quote, rules-based international order, unquote, that was created after World War II, mainly under American leadership, had been fading away anyway as the West's long economic dominance declined. The arrival of Donald Trump delivered the coup de grace, but nothing has taken its place. Well, first of all, that's kind of laughable that Donald Trump delivered the coup de grace. To my mind, Donald Trump in many ways is being scapegoated, and I'm not a huge fan. Like, I'm getting all of this like commentary where it's, oh, you're a Trumpist, I'm turning you off now. I'm not. Like, I don't understand the crazy, frankly, and I'm using that term specifically, crazy way people handle the issue of Donald Trump. That you either have to love him completely or hate him totally. There's no analyzing him the way you would analyze any other president. I've said it before on this channel, I didn't particularly love or agree with every policy of Obama's, but I could weigh the pros and cons of his presidency. I could do the same thing with Biden. I could do the same thing with George W. Bush, Clinton, H.W. Bush, Reagan. I have my own biases, but, you can weigh these things out. I don't understand. I'm starting to wonder if there's a movement to infantilize people's thinking about Donald Trump so that we don't analyze his presidency in an adult manner and make rational decisions about it. And I see this coming from two sides. Again, it's like you either love him completely or, you hate him totally, and there is no in between. It's really kind of ridiculous. And attributing every bad thing that's happening in the world to Donald Trump is, again, it's very childish. There's really no other word for it. And again, Donald Trump has not delivered any coup de grace. The Bretton Woods system has been in a state of flux throughout its entire lifetime, most notably when Nixon took us off the gold standard or temporarily shut the gold window. Things fundamentally changed thereafter. We saw major changes during the Clinton administration. We saw extreme changes during the George W. Bush administration when deficits and debt started going up a great deal. Then with the so-called great financial crisis, I rather prefer to call it the Lehman crisis, but that incident resulted in what became known as quantitative easing, aka money printing, which, by the way, the Western powers said you can never do that to places like Thailand in 1997 when they imposed austerity on them and all these strict IMF rules. But when they themselves went through economic problems, oh, no, they just printed the money and moved on down the road. And we're now seeing the aftermath of that in the inflation that is running rampant across a lot of the West. That said, and the point I'm trying to make with this video, Trump is not the reason the rules-based order is ending. Okay, he did not deliver any coup de grace. He is presiding over the country as we are seeing it go through a major transition. But, to say that he's delivered some coup de grace is pretty disingenuous. By the way, I think the writer of this article is the same guy that said Hun Sen was stupid, or implied that Hun Sen was stupid in a prior article. And I did a video where I basically said, Hun Sen's a lot of things. He's not stupid. Say whatever you want. A guy doesn't stay in power in a place like Cambodia for over 40 years and become very, very wealthy and be stupid. I mean, that's just not, those two things don't really go together. That said, going back to this, again, we are seeing a transition. I did a video over a year ago, I think, where I talked about the UASA shift, that there's a point at which the technological and innovative epicenter jumps, and the tendency is for it to go west. And what we're seeing, and I don't know that we're quite there exactly, but I think probably 10 years from now, and at what point in between would we say it exactly jumped is hard to say, but 10 years from now, I think it'd be safe to say that, yeah, there was a UASA shift which went from effectively Silicon Valley, and as I talked about at the time, Silicon Valley Bank was, in my mind, the sort of watershed moment that, or the red flag that tipped me off that, hey, this is happening, the Silicon Valley Bank collapse, that the Yuasa shift, the innovation center was moving to Asia. And this person gets into this, let me just keep quoting, quote, all the claptrap in the past week about the launch of a quote, of a new quote, Asian century, unquote, founders on the hard, unyielding fact that there is no Asia except in the strictly geographic sense. And what's your point? You know, I mean, there is no America except in the, you know, or North America, South America, except in the strictly geographic sense. And as we'll get to, you know, there's this grand opus for Europe, but the poo-pooing of Asia, which is just crazy to me. Quoting further, there was a stage-managed coming out party in Beijing for China's new superpower status with lots of Asian guests, but no actual deals were done. Well, couldn't that be because a lot of the deals have already been done? They're just showing up to party in the aftermath. It's the denouement, it's not the climax. You know, and again, I'm not, anybody who knows me, the notion of a very powerful communist state, i.e. China, and everybody seems to kind of forget that mainland China is communist, and I don't care what anybody says, oh, they've adopted capitalism and they're different, whatever. There is a building somewhere that effectively operates as a filing cabinet for Marxist doctrinaires and Maoist doctrinaires and Leninist doctrinaires to sit around and try to figure out how to get it right the next time, okay? That's what communism does. It sits there and tries to incubate the next Marxist revolution. It's never worked. It's terrible. Read Gulag Archipelago or anything else, or, you know, understand what it was. And I'm not saying the Soviet Union was absolutely imperfect. You know, it wasn't hell on earth necessarily, although the Stalin years, you could have made some serious arguments. But, you know, there's a reason it collapsed, okay? There's a reason the Chinese adopted Western economic thinking. It didn't work fundamentally. The only point I'm trying to make in this video, though, is, one, I'm not like gonna be a big pusher of the narrative that China's rise is like an inherent sort of monolithic good, okay? I do think they want to do business. They tend to not like to get going into wars, although maybe I'm being a little naive there, or they like to do war their way per se, you know, maybe that's the way to look at it. But my point is they tend to want to do business. That tends to be Asia's way. Everybody out here wants to make money. It doesn't matter Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, or the Middle Kingdom. You know, at the end of the day, we all just want to feed our families and get on with our lives. That's basically what everybody wants to do. But this notion that, oh, well, no deals were made. Well, yeah, because the BRICS has been doing nothing but building for the last couple of years in earnest, to say nothing of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And meanwhile, you know, I don't know if this was intentional. I don't think it necessarily was. But, you know, the bellicosity with which India was approached, especially by America recently, and how that's kind of nudged them over into a much less hostile posture vis-a-vis China especially, you know, it ain't good. You know, India was one member of the BRICS that, to my mind, leaned pretty heavily toward the West. Western economic thinking, albeit Keynesianism, which I'm not thrilled with, but, you know, a kind of affinity, if you will, for Anglo thinking, for the Anglosphere. I won't say they're Anglophiles, but they're English speakers, and they have an affinity for English language literature, English language content, if you will. That augured well for sort of the Anglosphere, the West, if you will. Again, to sort of see them alienated, and then you see Modi up hugging and, you know, you know, holding hands with Xi and Putin. I don't think you can just poo-poo that. You know, quoting further, and then we get into this, okay, so there's no Asia per se, but apparently there is a Europe. Quote unquote, Europe is a real strategic concept. It's 500 million inhabitants living in 100 countries, have cooperated, competed, and fought one another for 3 millennia. And they almost all belong to the same cultural universe. Is that the cultural universe that kept going to war so much that the Americans and the Russians had to split the place apart, like little kids being separated into kindergarten for 75 years? You know, I mean, this, as an American, especially as a Kansan, for years, it's just rankled me that Europe is sort of, especially when you read the history, that Europe is sort of placed on this pedestal as like this cradle of civilization. In many ways it is. The Greeks, the Romans, even the Holy Roman Empire, the British Empire, even the French to a certain extent during certain points, especially the ancient regime and, even the Napoleonic era, although primarily it brought us mostly new mechanisms for war and mostly new mechanisms. Although for law, on that point, Napoleon did a lot for that. But it was law brought at the end of a bayonet, so that's something else to keep in mind. The only point I'm trying to make is, it's always put on this pedestal. It's like, oh, it's so peaceful and everything's so good. Yeah, because others are securing its security, for one thing. Things like NATO, and you go back into the Cold War, the Russians had the Warsaw Pact, the Americans had NATO. They had to be split up like kindergartners. And then, now it's as if, there's never any problems whatsoever in Europe. It's the bastion of all civilization. I just don't see it. And frankly, if you look at footage of the modern Europe, and if you talk to any of the expats who are coming from over there, I mean, just talk to any of them, and they're not saying that same thing either. Quoting further, when they split up into rival alliances, as they do most of the time. So again, this person's even saying, oh, they split up all the time. So what are you talking about? And by the way, excuse me, I'm dealing with a bit of a cold here. By the way, China went through the warring states period, or various warring states period. I don't think anybody would disagree that China's civilized. Now, again, communism I have my own issues with. But, China is a civilized country. It always has been. In many ways, when the Westerners arrived out here, the one big determining factor between the two countries in terms of their might was guns. The book Guns, Germs, and Steel gets into a lot of those issues. But the point I'm trying to make is this notion of Europe as the only cradle of civilization is kind of ridiculous. Quoting further, even that process runs along familiar grooves. The Asian continent, by contrast, is rife with wars and confrontations. Really? Compared to World War I and World War II, I mean, especially World War I. World War I was just an unmitigated bloodbath, a mechanized bloodbath. There is still footage I was listening to a podcast years ago. There is still footage in the British archives of World War I soldiers, the human waves, that's still classified. It's so horrific, they just don't want people to see it. I mean, come on, this notion of Europe, Asia's all barbaric, but Europe's okay, And meanwhile, name me the major wars that have occurred out here recently. At the behest of whom? I mean, since World War II, you had Korea and you had Vietnam, which, again, I'm a pretty staunch anti-communist, so I can get on board with the reasoning behind them, but I don't think anybody would disagree with the idea that at the very least, outside forces exacerbated, in most cases, what was already an internal, rather limited, if not national, but like limited regional conflict. So this notion that Asia is somehow barbaric and Europe is not, just really rankles me. Quoting again, the Asian continent, by contrast, is rife with wars and confrontations, but almost never do they actually involve the entire continent. Would you remember World War II? I mean, that involved the entire continent. Quoting further, it's too big, too culturally diverse, too split up by mountain ranges and ocean straits, and fundamentally too lacking in common interests and ambitions that might bring it into conflict. Look, I haven't talked about this very much here. I talked about it on my other channel when I had it, and I may sort of resuscitate those videos. There was a guy in the British Empire days named Halford Mackinder that talked about the so-called World Island. There was the World Island in the periphery. And I disagree with Mackinder insofar as he believes that he who controls the World Island controls the world. Yeah, it's going to be, I don't think any one power can actually control the World Island, so that's part of it. But also, look, the periphery, so-called, is basically everything that's not the landmass of Eurasia and Africa, which that's a lot, and a lot of economic activity has come from there, most notably North and South America, and yes, Europe and Australia, and the rest of the sort of maritime world. You could call it a thassalocracy if you want. There's a lot of economic activity that's come from there. I don't see any reason why that's going to end. What I do see happening, though, whether people like it or not, and I'm kind of ambivalent on it, I'm of mixed minds on it. I think there's good sides and bad sides. I live here. I think for Thailand, it's going to cause a lot of soul searching, where they're going to have to make decisions that are going to come down to the national interest. And that's kind of the point of the video, is that's what Thailand should be focusing on, is the national interest and not these notions of grand world orders and things. Because if anything, BRICS, for whatever it represents, it does at least seem to embody an increasingly synergizing world island economically. Again, I don't think any one power is going to come to control it, but economically, Eurasia is coming together. It's being knit together slowly but surely, and there's going to be a lot of economic activity that comes out of that. Meanwhile, I don't think that the West is necessarily declining, although you can make serious arguments for that. While this thing, I've said it before and I'll say it again, it's not a zero-sum game. If the pie gets bigger and America or Europe continues to have the same piece they've always had, is that necessarily a bad thing, a good thing, or anything? It's just basically status quo as far as those jurisdictions are concerned. So I guess the point I'm trying to make with this video is, one, the notion of poo-pooing the idea of a new world order is kind of ridiculous. There's clearly folks that are trying for a new world order, but they're kind of trying in vain. The nation-state model seems to have consistently been the one that keeps coming to the foreground because people organize themselves most organically, not to be sort of redundant there, in nation-states. People that share their same cultural history, their same language. That's how they organize. And they're going to present themselves to the world through the prism of that nation-state model. I don't think that's ending anytime soon. I don't think the BRICS necessarily counters that. If anything, I think it probably will operate to maybe even amplify it a little bit as each of these nation-states pursues its national economic interests within the framework of not only BRICS, but broader international trade. So the point I'm trying to make with this video is, yeah, look, the rules-based order, the so-called Bretton Woods system, that's how I look at it. It's Bretton Woods, basically what came out of World War II in the international financial system, and that then came to fully dominate. So Nixon closes the gold window. Then in 91, specifically Christmas 91, Gorbachev basically throws in the towel with the USSR, and that's no longer a thing. So, it became the unipolar moment where we had this rules-based order. It's now going through another transition, and that transition is going to see changes out here in Asia. But I don't think you can either dismiss or belittle the upcoming economic might of the nation states here in Asia, nor do I think it's really a good idea to somehow belittle Asia versus Europe when comparing them as continents, because one, they don't operate as continents to begin with. Neither place does, much as the EU would like to say that it does. As a practical matter, if you look at geopolitics and things, it doesn't. But more to the point, that's not the prism to be looking through to figure out how is this all going to play out and what is going to be the economic landscape moving forward. My personal opinion, the notion of the UASA shift, Y-U-A-S-A, you can search for that in the search function of our channel. UASA shift, the notion that the innovative epicenter is moving to Asia, I think that is the best way to look at the way things are moving out here in Asia and Southeast Asia moving forward.